Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Praise of Fly podcast. Today is episode 16 of Sutton and the Wall Street Trilogy, part 8, FDR, Wall Street and FDR. So we left off at chapter 10, FDR remained on the white horse. Grayson M.P. Murphy Company, 52 Broadway. The central figure in the plot was Major General Smedley Darlington Butler, a colorful, popular, widely known Marine Corps officer, twice decorated with the Congressional Medal of Honor, and a veteran of 33 years of military service. General Butler testified in 1934 to the McCormick-Dickstein Committee investigating Nazi and communist activities in the United States that a plan for a White House dictatorship was outlined to him by two members of the American Legion, Gerald C. McGuire, who worked for Grayson M.P. Murphy & Co., 52 Broadway, New York City, and Bill Doyle, whom Butler identified as an officer of the American Legion. General Butler testified that these men wanted to unseat the royal family and control the American Legion at the convention to be held in Chicago, and were very anxious to have me take part in it. A scheme was outlined to General Butler. He was to come before the convention as a Legion delegate from Honolulu. There were 200 or 300 Legion members in the audience. And these planted fellows were to begin to cheer and start a stampede and yell for a speech. Then I was to go to the platform and make a speech. The prepared speech was to be written by Morgan associate John W. Davis. To prove his Wall Street financial backing, McGuire showed General Butler a bank book listing deposits of $42,000 US dollars and $64,000 US dollars, and mentioned that the source was Grayson M.P. Murphy, director of Guarantee Trust Company, and other Morgan-controlled companies. A millionaire banker, Robert S. Clark, with offices in the Stock Exchange building at 11 Wall Street, was also involved. Robert Clark was incidentally known to General Butler from his China campaign days. McGuire and Doyle also offered Butler a substantial sum to make a similar speech before the Convention of the Veterans of Foreign Wars at Miami Beach. According to McGuire, his group had investigated the background of Mussolini and Italian fascism, Hitler's organization in Germany, and the Croix de Feu in France, and hinted that it was time to establish a similar organization in the United States. General Butler testified to the Congressional Committee about McGuire's statements in the following words. He said, "The time has come now to get the soldiers together." "Yes," I said, "I think so too." He said, "I went abroad to study the part that the veterans play in the various setups of governments that they have abroad. I went to Italy for 2 or 3 months and studied the position that the veterans of Italy occupy in the fascist set-up government, and I discovered that they are the background of Mussolini. They keep them on their payrolls in various ways and keep them contented and happy, and they are his real backbone, the force on which he may depend, in case of trouble to sustain him. But that set-up would not suit us at all. The soldiers of America would not be like that. I then went to Germany to see what Hitler was doing, and his whole strength lies in organizations of soldiers too, but that would not do. I looked into the Russian business. I found that the use of the soldiers over there would never appeal to our men. Then I went to France, and I found just exactly the organization we are going to have. It is an organization of super soldiers. He gave me the French name for it, but I do not recall what it is. I never could have pronounced it anyhow, but I do know that it was a super organization of members of all the other soldiers' organizations of France, composed of non-commissioned officers and officers. He told me that they had about 500,000 and that each one was the leader of 10 others, so that it gave them 5 million votes. And he said, now that is our idea here in America, to get up an organization of that kind. What would be the objective of this super organization? According to the previously cited New York Times, General Butler is reported to have testified that the affair was an attempted coup d'etat to overthrow President Roosevelt and replace him with a fascist dictator. This interpretation is repeated by Archer, Seldes, and other writers. However, this was not the accusation made by Butler to the committee. Butler's precise statement concerning the projected organization, the use to which it was to be put when established, and the role of President Roosevelt is as follows. General Butler reported on his conversation with McGuire. I said, "What do you want to do with it when you get it up?" "Well," he said, "we want to support the president." I said, "The president does not need the support of that kind of an organization." "Since when did you become a supporter of the president?" "The last time I talked to you, you were against him." He said, "Well, he's going to go along with us now, is he?" "Yes." "Well, what are you going to do with these men? Suppose you get these 500,000 men in America. What are you going to do with them?" "Well," he said, they will be the support of the president." I said, "The president has got the whole American people. Why does he want them?" He said, "Don't you understand the setup has got to be changed a bit? Now we've got him. We've got the president. He has got to have more money. There's not any more money to give him. 80% of the money is now in government bonds. He cannot keep his racket up much longer. He's got to do something about it. He's either got to get more money out of us, or he has got to change the method of financing the government, and we are going to see to it that he does not change the method. He will not change it. I said, the idea of this great group of soldiers, then, is to sort of frighten him, is it? No, not to frighten him. This is to sustain him when other assaults him. I said, well, I do not know about that. How would the president explain it? He said, he will not necessarily have to explain it because we are going to help him out. Now, did it ever occur to you that the president is overworked? We might have an assistant president, somebody to take the blame. And if things do not work out, he can drop him. He went on to say that it did not take any constitutional change to authorize another cabinet office, somebody to take over the details of the office, take them off the president's shoulders. He mentioned that the position would be a Secretary of General Affairs, a sort of super secretary, Chairman Congressman McCormick, a Secretary of General Affairs, Butler. This is the term used by him, or Secretary of General Welfare. I cannot recall which. I came out of the interview with that name in my head. I got the idea from talking to both of them, you see. They had both talked about the same kind of relief that ought to be given to the president. And he said, the American people will swallow that. We have got the newspapers. We will start a campaign that the president's health is failing. Everyone can tell that by looking at him, and the dumb American people will fall for it in a second. And I can see it. They had that sympathy racket that they were going to have somebody take the patronage off his shoulders and take all the worries and details off his shoulders. And then he will be president. He will be like the president of France, I said. So that is where you got this idea. He said, I have been traveling around, looking around now about the super organization. Would you be interested in heading it? I said, I am interested in it, but I do not know about heading it. I am very greatly interested in it because, Jerry, my interest is my more hobby is maintaining a democracy. If you get these 500,000 soldiers advocating anything smelling of fascism, I'm going to get 500,000 more to look the hell out of you, and we will have a real war right at home. You know that. Oh, no, you don't want that. We want to ease up on the president. Yes, and then you'll put somebody in there you can run. Is that the idea? The president will go around and christen babies and dedicate bridges and kiss children. Mr. Roosevelt will never agree to that himself. Oh, yes, he will. He will agree to that. In other words, the Wall Street plot was not to dispose of President Roosevelt at all, but to kick him upstairs and install an assistant president with absolute powers. Just why it was necessary to go to the trouble of installing an assistant president is unclear because the vice president was in office. In any event, it was a plan to run the United States with the Secretary of General Affairs, and the gullible American public would accept this under the guise of the necessary protection from a communist takeover. At this point, it is interesting to recall the role of many of the same financiers and financial firms in the Bolshevik Revolution, a role, incidentally, that could not have been known to General Butler, and the use of similar Red Scare tactics in the 1922 United Americans Organization. Grayson MP Murphy was in the early 1930s a director of several companies controlled by the J.P. Morgan interests, including the Guaranteed Trust Company, prominent in the Bolshevik Revolution, the New York Trust Company, and Bethlehem Steel, and was on the board of Inspiration Copper Company, National Aviation Corporation, Intercontinental Rubber Co., and U.S. and Foreign Securities. John W. Davis, the speechwriter for General Butler, was a partner in Davis, Polk, Wardwell, Gardner, and Reed of 15 Broad Street. Both Polk and Wardwell of this prestigious law firm, as well as Grayson Murphy, had roles in the Bolshevik Revolution. Further, Davis was also co-director with Murphy in the Morgan-controlled Guaranteed Trust Company, and a co-director with the presidential hopeful Al Smith in the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, as well as the director of Mutual Life Insurance Company, the U.S. Rubber Company, and American Telephone and Telegraph in the controlling unit of the Bell system. Fortunately for history, General Butler discussed the offer with an impartial newspaper source at a very early point in his talks with McGuire and Doyle. The McCormick-Dixon Committee heard testimony under oath from this confident Paul Comely French. French confirmed the facts that he was a reporter for the Philadelphia Record and the New York Evening Post, and that General Butler had told him about the plot in September 1934. Subsequently, on September the 13th, 1934, French went to New York and met with McGuire. The following is part of French's statement to the committee. Mr. French, I saw Gerald P. McGuire in the offices of Grayson MP Murphy & Co., the 12th floor of 52 Broadway. Shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, he has a small private office there, and I went into his office. I have here some direct quotes from him. As soon as I left his office, I got to a typewriter and made a memorandum of everything that he told me. We need a fascist government in this country, he insisted, to save the nation from the communists who want to tear it down and wreck all that we have built in America. The only men who have the patriotism to do it are the soldiers, and Smelly Butler is the ideal leader. He can organize 1 million men overnight. During the conversation, he told me he had been in Italy and Germany during the summer of 1934 and the spring of 1934. There must be a typo here. I don't know what the typo would be. And had made an intensive study of the background of the Nazi and fascist movements and how the veterans had played a part in them. He said he had obtained enough information on the fascist and Nazi movements of the part played by the veterans to properly set up one in this country. He emphasized throughout his conversation with me that the whole thing was tremendously patriotic, that it was saving the nation from communists, and that the men they deal with have that crack-brained idea that the communists are going to take it apart. He said the only safeguard would be the soldiers. At first, he suggested that the general organize this outfit himself and ask $1 a year dues from everybody. We discussed that, and then he came around to the point of getting outside financial funds, and he said it would not be any trouble to raise $1 million. During the course of the conversation, he continually discussed the need of a man on a white horse, as he called it, a dictator, who would come galloping in on his white horse. He said that was the only way, either through the threat of armed force or the delegation of power and the use of a group of organized veterans to save the capitalist system. He warmed up considerably after we got underway, and he said we might go along with Roosevelt, and then we might do with him what Mussolini did with the King of Italy. It fits in with what he told General Butler, that we would have a Secretary of General Affairs, and if Roosevelt played ball, swell, and if he didn't, they would push him out. Axon Martindale, 14 Wall Street. The sworn testimony of General Smelly Butler and Paul French in the committee hearings has a persistent thread. General Butler rambled from time to time, and some parts of his statements are vague, but there is obviously a lot more to the story than innocent gathering of American Legion members into a super organization. Is there any independent evidence to confirm General Butler and Paul French? Unknown to both Butler and French, Guaranteed Trust had been involved in the Wall Street maneuverings in the Bolshevik Revolution, so indicating at least a predisposition to mix financial business with dictatorial politics. 2 of the persons involved in the plot were directors of Guaranteed Trust. Also, before the hearings were abruptly halted, the committee heard evidence from an independent source which confirmed many details recounted by General Butler and Paul French. In December of 1934, Captain Samuel Glazier, commanding officer of the C camp at Elk Ridge, Maryland, was called before the committee. On October the 2nd, 1934, testified Captain Glazier, he had received a letter from A.P. Sullivan, Assistant Adjutant General of the U.S. Army, introducing a Mr. Jackson Martindale, who will be shown every courtesy by you. This letter was sent to Glazier by command of Major General Malone of the U.S. Army. Who was Jackson Martindale? He was a financial counsel with offices at 14 Wall Street, previously associated with Stone & Webster and Blockett, Inc. Investment bankers of 120 Broadway and with Carter, Martindale & Co., investment bankers at 150 Broadway. Martindale was a man of substance, living, according to the New York Times, in the center of a beautiful 60-acre estate that he had bought from Charles Pfizer, and was sufficiently influential for General Malone to arrange a conducted tour of the Elk Ridge, Maryland, Conservation Corps camp. Martindale's association with Stone & Webster and 120 Broadway is significant and by itself warrants a follow-up on his associations in the Wall Street area. Captain Glazier provided Martindale with the requested camp tour and testified to the committee that Martindale posed numerous questions about similar camp for men to work in industry rather than in forests. A week or so after the visit, Captain Glazier visited Martindale's New Jersey home, learned that he was a personal friend of General Malone, and was informed that Martindale wanted to organize camps similar to the C to train 500,000 young men. The overtones of this talk, as reported by Glazier, were anti-Semitic and suggesting an attempted coup d'etat in the United States. The organization sponsoring this overthrow was called American Vigilantes, whose emblem was a flag with a red eagle on a blue background in lieu of the German swastika. This was in part an independent verification of General Butler's testimony. Gerald C. McGuire's testimony. Gerald C. McGuire, one of the accused plotters, was called before the committee and testified at length under oath. He stated that he met General Butler in 1933, and that his reasons for visiting Butler were, 1, to discuss the committee for sound dollar, and 2, that he thought Butler would be a fine man to be commander of the Legion. McGuire admitted that he had told General Butler that he was a member of the Distinguished Guest Committee of the American Legion. He had had a hazy recollection that millionaire Robert S. Clark had talked to Butler, but denied emphatically making arrangements for Clark to meet Butler. McGuire admitted sending Butler postcards from Europe, that he had a conversation with the general at Bellevue Stafford Hotel, and that he had told Butler that he was going to the convention in Miami. However, when asked whether he had told Butler about the role veterans played in European governments, he replied that he had not, although he stated he had told Butler that in his opinion Hitler would not last another year in Germany and that Mussolini was on the skids. McGuire's testimony of his meeting with French differs substantially from French's account. Question. Now, what did Mr. French call to see you about, Mr. McGuire? Answer. He called, according to Mr. French's story, to meet me and to make my acquaintance because I had known General Butler and I was a friend of his. And he wanted to know me, and that was mainly the object of his visit. Question. Nothing else discussed? Answer. A number of things discussed, yes. The position of the bond market, the stock market, what I thought was a good buy right now, what he could buy if he had $700 or $800, the position of the country, the prospects for recovery, and various topics that any two men would discuss if they came together. Question, nothing else? Answer, nothing else except this, Mr. Chairman. As I said yesterday, I believe when Mr. French came to me, he said General Butler is or has again been approached by 2 or 3 organizations, and I think he mentioned one of them as some vigilante committee of this country. And he said, what do you think of it? And I think I said to him, why, I don't think the general ought to get mixed up with any of those affairs in this country. I think these fellows are trying to use him, to use his name for publicity purposes and to get membership, and I think he ought to keep away from any of these organizations. Nothing else. Question, nothing else? Answer, nothing else. This was the gist of the entire conversation. McGuire further testified that he worked for Grayson Murphy and that Robert S. Clark had put up $300,000 to form the committee for a sound dollar. The McCormick-Dickstein committee was able to confirm the fact that Robert Sterling Clark transmitted money to McGuire for political purposes. McGuire further testified that this money was given him by Mr. Clark long after the Chicago Convention of the Legion, and that he had also received from Walter E. Frew of the Corn Exchange Bank and Trust Co. the sum of $1,000, which was also placed to the credit of the Sound Money Committee. McGuire then testified that he received from Robert Sterling Clark approximately $7,200 for his traveling expenses to, in, and from Europe, to which he had added the sum of $2,500 and on another occasion and $1,000 at another time. And he stated under oath that he did not receive anything from anybody else, and further testified that he had deposited it in his personal account in the Manufacturers Trust Co., 55 Broad Street. McGuire further testified that he had a drawing account of $432 a month right now, to which were added some commissions. Later, McGuire testified that $2,500 and the $1,000 came from were in connection with the organization of the Committee for a Sound Dollar. Chairman McCormick then directed the following question. Did Mr. Clark contribute any money in any other way besides $30,000? And the other sums that you have enumerated he gave to you personally? To which McGuire replied, no, sir. He has been asked several times to contribute to different funds, but he has refused. In its New York press release, the committee noted several discrepancies in McGuire's testimony on receipt of funds. The section reads as follows. Neither could McGuire remember what the purpose of his trip was to Washington, or whether he had given the Central Hanover Bank $13 or $1,000 bills, or that he had bought one of the letters of credit with a certified check drawn on the account of Mr. Christmas. In the course of the questioning, McGuire could not remember whether he had even handled $1,000 bills, and certainly could not remember producing 13 of them at once time in the bank. It must be remembered in this connection that the $13,000 purchase with $1,000 bills at the bank came just 6 days after Butler claims McGuire showed him an 18 $1,000 bills in Newark. From the foregoing, it can readily be seen that in addition to the $30,000 which Clark gave McGuire for the Sound Money Committee, that he produced approximately $75,000 more, which McGuire reluctantly admitted on being confronted with the evidence. This $75,000 is shown in the $26,000 that went into the Manufacturers Trust account, $10,000 in currency at the luncheon, the purchase of letters of credit totaling $30,300, of which Christmas certified check was represented as $15,000, expenses to Europe close to $8,000. This stands unexplained. Whether there was more and how much, the committee does not yet know. The committee then asked McGuire an obvious question, whether he knew Jackson Martindale. Unfortunately, an equally obvious error in McGuire's answer was allowed to pass by unchallenged. The committee transcript reads as follows by the chairman. Question. Do you know Mr. Martindale, Mr. McGuire? Mr. Martindale? No, sir, I do not. Is that his name? I think so. So in brief, we have three reliable witnesses, General Butler, Paul French, and Captain Samuel Glazier, testifying under oath about plans of a plot to install a dictatorship in the United States. And we have contradictory testimony from Gerald McGuire that clearly warrants further investigation. Such investigation was, at first, the committee's stated intention. The committee is awaiting the return to this country of both Mr. Clark and Mr. Christmas. As the evidence stands, it calls for an explanation that the committee has been unable to obtain from Mr. McGuire. But the committee did not call either Mr. Clark or Mr. Christmas to give evidence. It made no further effort, at least no further effort appears on the public record, to find any explanation for the inconsistencies and inaccuracies in McGuire's testimony that was given to the committee under oath. Suppression of Wall Street involvement. The story of an attempted takeover of the executive power in the United States was suppressed not only by parties directly interested, but also by several institutions, usually regarded as protectors of constitutional liberty and freedom of inquiry. Among the groups suppressing information were 1, the Congress of the United States, 2, the press, notably the Time and the New York Times, and 3, the White House itself. It is also notable that no academic inquiry has been conducted into what is surely one of the more ominous events in recent American history. Suppression is even more regrettable in the light of the current trend towards collectivism in the United States and the likelihood of another attempt at a dictatorial takeover using supposed threats from either the left or the right as a pretext. Suppression by the House Un-American Activities Committee took the form of deleting extensive excerpts relating to Wall Street financiers, including Guaranty Trust Director Grayson Murphy, J.P. Morgan, and DuPont interests, Remington Arms, and others allegedly involved in the plot attempt. Even today, in 1975, a full transcript of the hearings cannot be traced. Some of the deleted portions of the transcript were unearthed by reporter John Spivak. 16A, a reference to NRA Administrator Hugh Johnson, will show the type of information suppressed. The committee suppressed the words in italics from the printed testimony. Butler speaks to McGuire. I said, is there anything stirring about it yet? Yes, he says. You watch. In 2 or 3 weeks, you will see it come out in the papers. There will be big fellows in it. And in about 2 weeks, the American Liberty League appeared, which was just about what he described it to be. We might have an assistant president, somebody to take the blame, and if things do not work out, he can drop them, he said. That is what he was building up Hugh Johnson for. Hugh Johnson talked too damn much and got him into a hole, and he was going to fire him in the next 3 or 4 weeks. I said, how do you know all this? Oh, he said, we are in with him all the time. We know what is going to happen. The testimony of Paul French was also censored by the House Committee, who witnessed the following extract from French's testimony referring to John W. Davis, J.P. Morgan, the DuPont Company, and others in Wall Street, and which strongly corroborates General Butler's testimony. At first, Hugh McGuire suggested that General Butler organize this outfit himself and ask $1 a year dues from everybody. We discussed that, and then he came around to the point of getting outside financial funds, and he said it would not be any trouble to raise $1 million. He said he could go to John W. Davis, attorney for J.P. Morgan Company, or Perkins of the National City Bank, and any number of persons to get it. Of course, that may or may not mean anything. That is, his reference to John W. Davis and Perkins of the National City Bank. During my conversation with him, I did not, of course, commit the general to anything. I was just feeling him along. Later, we discussed the question of arms and equipment, and he suggested that they could be obtained from the Remington Arms Company on credit through the DuPonts. I do not think at the time he mentioned the connections of DuPont with the American Liberty League, but he skirted all around it. That is, I do not think he mentioned the Liberty League, but he skirted all around the idea that there was the back door. One of the DuPonts is on the board of directors of the American Liberty League, and they own a controlling interest in the Remington Arms Co. He said the general would not have any trouble enlisting 500,000 men. John L. Spivak, the reporter who unearthed the suppression in the congressional transcripts, challenged committee co-chairman Samuel Dixon of New York with his evidence. Dixon admitted that the committee had deleted certain parts of the testimony because they were hearsay. But your published reports are full of hearsay testimony. They are, he said. Why wasn't Grayson Murphy called? Your committee knew that Murphy's men are in the anti-Semitic espionage organization Order of 76. We didn't have the time. We'd have taken care of the Wall Street groups if we had the time. I would have no hesitation in going after the Morgans. You had Bill Grano, commander of the American Legion, listed to testify. Why wasn't he examined? I don't know. Maybe you can get Mr. McCormick to explain that. I had nothing to do with it. The fact remains that the committee did not call Grayson Murphy, Jackson Martindale, or John W. Davis, all directly accused in sworn testimony. Further, the committee deleted all portions of the testimony involving other prominent persons: J.P. Morgan, the DuPonts, the Rockefeller interests, Hugh Johnston, and Franklin D. Roosevelt. When Congressman Dick Stein pleaded his innocence to John Spivak, it was inconsistent with his own letter to President Roosevelt, in which he claimed to have placed restrictions upon public distribution of the committee's hearings as printed, in order that they might not get into other than responsible hands. The final report issued by the committee in February 15, 1935, buried the story even further. John L. Spivak sums up the burial succinctly. I studied the committee's report. It gave 6 pages to the threat by Nazi agents operating in this country and 11 pages to the threat by communists. It gives 1 page to the plot to seize the government and destroy our democratic system. The role of the leading newspapers and journals of opinion in reporting the Butler affair is equally suspect. In fact, their handling of the event has the appearance of outright distortion and censorship. The veracity of some major newspapers have been widely questioned in the last 50 years. And in some quarters, the media have even been accused of a conspiracy to suppress everything in opposition to the wishes of interest served. For example, in 1917, Congressman Callaway inserted in the Congressional Record the following devastating critique of Morgan control of the press. Mr. Callaway: Mr. Chairman, under unanimous consent, I insert in the record at this point a statement showing the newspaper combination which explains their activity in this war matter, just discussed by the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Moore. In March 1915, the J.P. Morgan interests, the steel, shipbuilding, and powder interests, and the subsidiary organizations got together, 12 men high up in the newspaper world, and employed them to select the most influential newspapers in the United States, and a sufficient number of them to control generally the policy of the daily press of the United States. These 12 men worked the problem out by selecting 179 newspapers, and then began by an elimination process to retain only those necessary for the purpose of controlling the general policy of daily press throughout the country. They found it was only necessary to purchase the control of 25 of the greatest papers. 25 papers were agreed upon. Emissaries were sent to purchase the policy, national and international, of these papers. An agreement was reached. The policy of the papers was bought to be paid for by the month. An editor was furnished for each paper to properly supervise and edit information regarding the questions of preparedness, militarism, financial policies, and other things of national and international nature, considered vital to the interests of the purchasers. This contract is in existence at the present time, and it accounts for the news columns of the daily press of the country being filled with all sorts of preparedness arguments and misrepresentations as to the present condition of the United States Army and Navy and the possibility and probability of the United States being attacked by foreign foes. This policy also included the suppression of everything in opposition to the wishes of the interests served. The effectiveness of this scheme has been conclusively demonstrated by the character of the stuff carried in the daily press throughout this country since March 1915. They have resorted to anything necessary to commercialize public sentiment and sandbag the National Congress, thus making extravagant and wasteful appropriations for the Army and Navy under the false pretense that it was necessary. Their stock argument is that it is patriotism. They are playing on every prejudice and passion of the American people. In the Butler affair, the accused interests are also those identified by Congressman Callaway, the J.P. Morgan firm, and the steel and powder industries. General Butler accused Grayson Murphy, a director of the Morgan-controlled Guarantee Trust Company, Jackson Martindale, associated with Stone and Webster, allied to the Morgans, the DuPont Company, the powder industry, and Remington Arms Company, which was controlled by DuPont and the Morgan-Harriman financial interests. Further, the firms that appear in the suppressed 1934 congressional testimony are J.P. Morgan, DuPont, and Remington Arms. In brief, we can verify 1934 congressional suppression of information that supports the earlier 1917 charges of Congressman Callaway. Does such suppression extend to major news journals? We can take 2 prime examples, the New York Times and Time magazine. If such a combination as Callaway charges did exist, then these 2 journals would certainly be among the 25 of the greatest papers involved in the 1930s. The New York Times reporting of the plot opens up with a front-page headline article on November the 21st, 1934. General Butler bears fascist plot to seize government by force. With the leading paragraph quoted above, this Times article is a reasonably good job of reporting and includes a forthright statement by Congressman Dick Stein from present indications Butler has the evidence. He's not going to make any serious charges unless he has something to back them up. We'll have men with bigger names than his. Then the Times article record that Mr. Dickstein said that about 16 persons mentioned by Butler to the committee would be subpoenaed and that a public hearing might be held next Monday. The Times also includes outright and sometimes unraged denials from Hugh Johnson, Thomas W. Lamont, and Grayson MP Murphy of Guarantee Trust. The following morning, November the 22nd, the Times made a major switch in reporting the plot. The disclosures were moved to an inside page, although the testimony now concerned General Gerald McGuire, one of the accused plotters. Further, a dedicated change in the attitude of the committee can be discerned. Congressman McCormick is now reported as saying that the committee has not decided whether to call any additional witnesses. He said that the most important witness, aside from Mr. McGuire, was Robert Sterling Clark, a wealthy New Yorker with offices in Stock Exchange Building. While the Times reporting was consigned to an inside single column, the editorial page, its most influential section, carried a leading editorial that set the tone for subsequent reporting. Under the head Credulity Unlimited, it contended that the Butler charge was a bald and unconvincing narrative. The whole story sounds like a gigantic hoax. It does not merit serious discussion, and so on. In brief, before the 16 important witnesses were called, before the evidence was on the record, before the charge was investigated, the New York Times decided it wanted to hear nothing about the story because it was a hoax, not fit to print. The next day, November 23rd, the Times changed its reporting still further. The headlines were now about Reds and Red Union strife and concerned aligned activities by communists and American trade unions, while the Butler testimony and the developing evidence were secretly deep within the reporting of Red activities. The resulting story was, of course, vague and confused, but it effectively buried the Butler evidence. On November the 26th, the hearings continued, but the committee itself now had cold feet and issued a statement. This committee has had no evidence before that would in the slightest degree warrant calling before it such men as John W. Davis, General Hugh Johnson, General James G. Harbord, Thomas W. Lamont, Admiral William S. Sims, or Hanford McNider. It should be noted that these names had come up in sworn testimony, later to be deleted from the official record. The Times pursued its reporting of this development in abbreviated form on an inside page under the head, Committee Calm Over Butler Plot Has No Evidence to Warrant Calling Johnson and Others. On November the 27th, the Times reporting declined to 5 column inches on an inside page under the ominous head, Butler Plot Inquiry Not to be Dropped. The December hearings were reported by the Times on a front page, December the 28th, 1934. But the plot was now twisted to Red's plot to kidnap the president, witness charges at House Inquiry. Reviewing the story of the Butler affair in the Times 40 years after the event, and comparing its story to the printed official testimony itself heavily censored, it is obvious that the newspaper, either under its own initiative or under outside pressure, decided that the story was not to be made public. Consistent with this interpretation, we find that the New York Times, the newspaper of record, omits the Butler testimony from entries in its annual index, depended upon by researchers and scholars. The Times Index for 1934 has an entry, Butler Major General Spendley D., but lists only a few of his speeches and a biographic portrait. The Butler testimony is not listed. There is an entry, see also Fascism U.S., but under the cross-reference, there is only listed Major General S.D. Butler, charges plot to overthrow present government, Wall Street interests, and G.P. McGuire implicated at a Congress Com hearing. The only significant Wall Street name mentioned in the index is that of R.S. Clark, who was reported as puzzled by the charges. None of the key Morgan and DuPont associates cited by General Butler is listed in the index. In other words, there appears to have been a deliberate attempt by this newspaper to mislead historians. Time Magazine's reporting descended to fiction in its attempts to reduce General Butler's evidence to the status of absurdity. If ever a student wanted to construct an example of biased reporting, there is a first-rate example in a comparison of the evidence presented to the McCormick-Dickstein Committee by General Butler with the subsequent Time reportage. The December 3rd, 1934 issue of Time ran the story under the head Plot Without Plotters. But the story bears no resemblance at all to the testimony, not even the censored testimony. The story portrays General Butler leading 500,000 men along U.S. Highway 1 with the cry, "Men, Washington is about 30 miles away. Will you follow me?" Butler was then depicted as taking over the U.S. government by force from President Roosevelt. The remainder of the Times story is filled with grudges from Butler's past and an assortment of denials from the accused. Nowhere is there any attempt to report the statements made by General Butler, although the denials by J.P. Morgan, Hugh Johnson, Robert Sterling Clark, and Grayson Murphy are cited correctly. 2 photographs are included, a genial grandfatherly J.P. Morgan and a General Butler in a pose that universally symbolizes lunacy, a finger pointed to his ear. The reporting was trashy, dishonest, and disgraceful journalism at its very worst. Whatever our thoughts may be on Nazi propaganda or Soviet press distortion, neither Goebbels nor Gosselaar ever attained the hypnotic expertise of Times journalists and editors. The fearful problem is that the opinions and mores of millions of Americans and of English speakers around the world have been molded by the school of distorted journalism. To keep our criticism in perspective, it must be noted that Time was apparently impartial in its pursuit of lurid journalism. Even U.S. Johnson, administrator of NRA, and one of the alleged plotters in the Butler affair, was a target of Time's mischief. As Johnson reports it in his book, I stood in the reviewing stand in that parade, and there were hundreds of people I knew who waved as they went past. Down below were massed batteries of cameras, and I knew if I raised my finger higher than my shoulders, it would seem and be publicized as a fascist salute. So I never did raise it higher. I just stuck my arm out straight and wiggled my hand abroad, but that didn't help me. Time came out saying I'd consistently saluted Mussolini and even had a photograph to prove it. But it wasn't my arm on that photograph. It wore the taped cuff sleeve of a castaway coat and a stiff round cuff with an old-fashioned cuff button, and I never wore either in my whole life. I think it was the arm of Mayor O'Brien who stood beside me, which had been faked onto my body. An assessment of the Butler affair. The most important point to be assessed is the credibility of General Smedley Darlington Butler. Was General Butler lying? Was he telling the truth? Was he exaggerating for the sake of effect? General Butler was an unusual man, and particularly unusual man to find in the armed forces. Decorated twice with the Medal of Honor, an unquestioned leader of men with undoubted personal bravery, deep loyalty to his fellow men, and a fierce sense of justice, all these are admirable qualities. Certainly General Butler was hardly the type of man to tell lies or even exaggerate for a petty reason. His flair for the dramatic does leave open a possibility of exaggeration, but deliberate lying is most unlikely. Does the evidence support or reject Butler? Reporter Paul French of the Philadelphia Record wholly supports Butler. Evidence by Captain Glazier, commander of the Triple C camp, supports Butler. In these 2 cases, there is no discrepancy in the evidence. The statements of McGuire made under oath of Congress do not support Butler. We have therefore a conflict of sworn evidence. Further, McGuire was found at fault on several points by the committee. He used the evasion of do not recall on a number of occasions. And in major areas, such as the financing by Clark, McGuire unwillingly supports Butler. There was a hard core of plausibility to the Butler story. There is some possibility of exaggeration, perhaps untypical for a man of Butler's flamboyant personality. But this is neither proven nor disproven. Without question, the Congress of the United States did a grave disservice to the cause of freedom in suppressing the Butler story. Let us hope that some congressman or some congressional committee, even at this late date, will pick up the threads and release the full uncensored testimony. We may also hope that the next time around, in some comparably important matter, the New York Times will live up to its claim to be a newspaper of record, a name it justified so admirably 4 decades later in the Watergate investigation. Okay, interesting footnote here. See Jules Archer, The Plot to Seize the White House. Jules Archer's book is the first effort to tell the whole story of the plot in sequence and full detail, which has extensive material on the plot. The interested reader should also take a look at George Seld's 1,000 Americans. Unfortunately, while these books have kept the event alive, a valiant effort that should by no means be underrated, they do reflect an amateurish confusion of fascism with moderation. Supporters of the Constitution would, of course, absolutely reject the dictatorial efforts described. Some groups, such as the American Conservative Union, for instance, have for a decade aimed their attacks at the targets identified by Archer and Selds. The misinterpretation by the latter authors is accentuated because confusion over the meaning of conservatism also prevents these authors from exploring the possibility that Wall Street had none other than Franklin Delano Roosevelt in mind as the man on the white horse. Well, I think we will leave it here, guys. The Butler affair was very interesting. What I like about Sutton he's very judicious with the evidence. It's suspicious, but it's hard to draw firm conclusions. I think the biggest piece of evidence in favor of the Butler affair and everything Sutton has said, who's been with me on this course, is so much of it has been deep sixed. Why? Well, I think when you figure that out, it answers itself. Cyber Ninja Zero, Tricky Woo, Record Deepness, Manoan, JLM, howdy, hello. Well, tune in next week for episode 17 of Sutton and Wall Street, part 9 of Wall Street and FDR. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.